Today, a simple visit to a car dealership takes an unimaginable turn for Mohamed Salah. A false accusation, a viral scandal, and a chance at redemption. Will justice prevail, or will prejudice win again? Watch this incredible story unfold. Tell us, where are you watching from today? We love to know. Mohamed Salah walked into the luxury car dealership in the heart of a bustling American city, dressed casually in a hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. He'd always been passionate about cars, and after months of hard work, he decided to reward himself with a new one. He admired the sleek vehicles on display, running his fingers over the glossy finishes, inhaling the intoxicating scent of polished leather and powerful engines. A young salesman, fresh-faced Chad, noticed him, hesitating for a second, as if trying to place that familiar face. Before Chad could approach, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir?" A blonde woman in an elegant suit, Barbara, stepped forward, her expression tight. "Are you lost?" Salah turned to her, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Not at all. I was just looking around." Barbara, the store manager, narrowed her eyes, a calculating glint within them. "We don't allow loitering here. These cars are not for browsing." Her tone dripped with disdain. Salah's smile faded, a knot forming in his stomach. "I'm interested in buying one." Barbara crossed her arms, her gaze raking over him from head to toe, a silent judgment passing. "I see. And do you have an appointment? We usually deal with serious buyers only." Chad, recognizing Salah now, shifted uncomfortably. "Actually, ma'am, I think he—" "Enough, Chad," Barbara cut him off, her voice like ice. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." For a moment, Salah considered revealing his identity, the weight of his accomplishments a shield against her prejudice. But he stopped himself. Why should he have to prove anything? With a deep, steadying breath, he met Barbara's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Are you refusing to sell me a car?" Barbara smirked, a cruel twist of her lips. "I'm refusing to waste my time." Salah turned away, but not before noticing Chad's uneasy expression. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He took another deep breath, his patience wearing thin, the familiar sting of discrimination burning in his chest. He had dealt with this before, but there was something particularly sharp about Barbara's tone. It wasn't just skepticism. It was condescension, a blatant dismissal of his worth. "I don't need an appointment to buy a car, do I?" he asked, keeping his voice level, a Herculean effort given the anger boiling inside him. Barbara chuckled, a humorless, patronizing sound. "Look, I don't know what kind of business you're used to, but these cars aren't for test drives and selfies. We deal with serious customers." Chad fidgeted beside her, his discomfort palpable. "Ma'am, I really think—" Barbara held up a hand, silencing him with a glare. "Chad, I said enough." Salah's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck straining. "And what exactly makes you think I'm not a serious customer?" Barbara sighed, as if explaining something painfully obvious to a child. "Sir, let's be honest. Guys like you don't usually walk in here unless they're delivering food or trying to take pictures next to the cars." A few customers nearby turned their heads, sensing the escalating tension. Their curiosity piqued, their own biases perhaps stirring. Salah's fingers curled into fists, his knuckles white, but he forced himself to stay composed, to maintain the dignity she was trying so hard to strip away. "I see," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "So because of how I look, you assume I don't belong here?" Barbara let out a dry, brittle laugh. "Let's just say I have instincts about these things, and considering, well, the way the world is today, I have to be extra cautious." Salah's stomach twisted, a sickening feeling of dread washing over him. He knew exactly what she was implying. She wasn't just assuming he was poor. She was treating him as if he were dangerous, a threat. The injustice of it all was a physical weight on his chest. "You have nothing to worry about," he said, his voice remarkably calm, but firm, a testament to his years of dealing with this kind of ignorance. Barbara raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, a challenge in her eyes. "Then you won't mind if I ask security to check that bag you're carrying?" Chad's eyes widened in alarm. "Ma'am, that's completely unnecessary." Salah exhaled sharply, struggling to control the fury that threatened to erupt. "You're crossing a line." Barbara tilted her head, unfazed, a smugness settling on her features. "If you have nothing to hide, there shouldn't be a problem." Salah glanced around. People were watching now, some whispering amongst themselves, their gazes judgmental, their assumptions solidifying. He could feel the weight of their stares, the silent condemnation. At that moment, a man in a sharp, expensive suit, Mr. Thompson, walked into the showroom. His eyes locked onto Salah, and his expression instantly changed, shifting from casual disinterest to startled recognition. "Wait," Mr. Thompson said, stepping forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "What's going on here?" Barbara turned to him, annoyance flickering across her face. "I'm handling it, Mr. Thompson." Mr. Thompson, the dealership owner, looked from Salah to Barbara, then back at Salah again. His face paled, the blood draining from his cheeks. Salah watched as recognition dawned on the man's face, the shift in his demeanor immediate and dramatic. Barbara, however, remained oblivious, trapped in her own prejudiced bubble. "This gentleman was just leaving," she said dismissively, a hint of impatience in her voice. Mr. Thompson's jaw tightened, his voice dangerously low. "Barbara, do you have any idea who you just insulted?" For the first time, Barbara looked genuinely confused, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She glanced at Mr. Thompson, then back at Salah, as if searching for an answer, a clue to this sudden shift in power. I don't understand," she said, her voice losing some of its sharpness, a tremor of doubt creeping in. Mr. Thompson let out a slow, controlled breath, clearly trying to restrain his mounting frustration. "Barbara, do you even watch football?" Barbara frowned, bewildered. "Football?" Chad, unable to hold back any longer, stepped forward, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and exasperation. "Ma'am, this is Mohamed Salah, one of the biggest football players in the world. He plays for Liverpool." Barbara blinked, her lips parted slightly, but then she let out a scoff, a desperate attempt to regain control. "You're joking." Mr. Thompson didn't laugh. His gaze was steely, unwavering. "I am not. And judging by the way you just treated him, I have a serious problem on my hands." Silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken accusations and dawning realizations. A few customers whispered amongst themselves, some even pulling out their phones, their screens glowing in the hushed showroom. Salah had noticed them before, but now he could tell, with a sinking feeling, that people were recording, capturing this ugly scene for posterity. Barbara's expression flickered between disbelief and discomfort, the carefully constructed facade of professionalism crumbling before her eyes. "Well, Before she could finish, a man in a business suit, David, approached, his phone in hand, held up like a weapon. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing," he said, his voice laced with righteous indignation. "Did you just accuse Mohamed Salah of—" He hesitated, his face twisting in disgust. "Being some kind of criminal?" Barbara's face turned crimson, a fiery blush spreading across her cheeks. "That's not what I said," Chad muttered under his breath, barely audible. "It's exactly what you said." Salah stayed quiet, a silent observer in this unfolding drama, watching the consequences of prejudice ripple outwards. David continued, his voice rising in anger. "Because from what I saw, it looked like you assumed he was either too poor to be here or a threat to the store. Either way, That's a serious problem. Another customer, Susan, spoke up, her voice trembling with outrage. I was recording the whole thing. The way she asked security to check his bag, completely unacceptable. Barbara's breath quickened, her composure shattered. She turned to Mr. Thompson, her voice pleading, desperate. Sir, this is being blown out of proportion. I was just doing my job. Mr. Thompson looked at her with a mixture of disappointment and anger, his gaze cold and unforgiving. Your job? Your job is to sell cars, not to humiliate customers, and certainly not to insult one of the most respected athletes in the world. More phones came out, their cameras flashing, recording every excruciating moment. People were typing furiously, their thumbs flying across the screens. Salah could already see where this was going. By tonight, this would be all over social media, a viral firestorm of condemnation. He sighed, a weary resignation settling over him. He turned to Barbara, his voice devoid of anger, only a profound sadness remaining. I don't want an apology, he said simply. I just hope you learn from this. But it was already too late. Barbara's mistake wasn't just going to cost her respect. It was about to cost her everything. By the time Salah stepped out of the dealership, the damage had already been done. The videos had hit social media with the speed of a wildfire. Within minutes, clips of the encounter flooded Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Some focused on Barbara's dismissive tone, others on her blatant racial profiling. But the one gaining the most traction was the video of her questioning Salah as if he were a criminal, the implicit accusation hanging heavy in the air. Did she really ask to check his bag? This woman just accused Mohamed Salah of being a threat in the city. Disgusting behavior. This is what everyday racism looks like. Salah wasn't surprised. He had seen situations like this happen to others too many times before. The difference was that this time it had happened to him, and the world was watching. Back inside the dealership, Barbara's phone buzzed incessantly. Messages, calls, notifications, a relentless barrage of digital condemnation. Her name was being dragged through the mud, her reputation tarnished, perhaps irreparably. She looked up, her eyes meeting Mr. Thompson's. His expression was stone cold, devoid of any sympathy. We need to talk, he said, his voice low and controlled, a finality in his tone. She followed him into his office, her heart pounding in her chest, a sickening dread filling her gut. She had worked at this dealership for years, climbing the ranks, proving herself, sacrificing everything for her career. And yet, one mistake, one terrible misjudgment, and suddenly, she was the villain, the pariah. Sir, I really think this is being taken out of context, she started, forcing a nervous smile, a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his voice sharp and unforgiving. Out of context. You humiliated a man who is not only a paying customer, but also one of the biggest football stars in the world. And worse, you did it in front of cameras. Barbara swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. I didn't know who he was. That's the problem, Mr. Thompson snapped, his voice rising in anger. It shouldn't have mattered. Do you treat all customers like this, or just the ones who look like him? Barbara opened her mouth to protest, to defend herself, but found no words, no excuses that could possibly justify her actions. You accused him of being dangerous, Barbara, he continued, his voice filled with disappointment, a profound sense of betrayal. Do you have any idea how serious that is? Barbara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. I didn't mean. It doesn't matter what you meant. He took a deep breath and shook his head, his gaze unwavering. I can't have someone like you representing my business. You're suspended, effective immediately. Her stomach dropped, a cold wave of fear washing over her. Suspended? I need time to review this situation, he continued, his voice devoid of any warmth. But given the backlash, I'd be surprised if you still have a job by the end of the week. Barbara stood frozen, her mind reeling, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen her. This wasn't happening. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, for everything to fall apart like this. Meanwhile, outside, Salah was still surrounded by fans, many of them apologizing on behalf of their city, their voices filled with genuine remorse. "Sorry, mate," one of them said, shaking his head. "That woman doesn't represent us." Salah nodded, a weary smile on his face. "I know." But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about one woman. This was bigger than Barbara. This was a systemic problem, a deeply ingrained prejudice that permeated society. And soon, the whole world would see it. By the next morning, the scandal had gone global. Major news outlets picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of racial profiling, the headlines screaming injustice. Liverpool star Mohamed Salah faces discrimination at car dealership. Football legend wrongfully accused. Dealer faces backlash. Social media calls for firing of racist manager in viral video. Barbara woke up to hundreds of notifications, a digital avalanche of hate and condemnation. She had turned her phone off the night before, hoping the storm would die down, that the internet's short attention span would move on to the next outrage. But it had only gotten worse. Her LinkedIn page was flooded with angry comments. Her Instagram was a war zone. And then there were the emails, some from furious customers demanding refunds, others from colleagues distancing themselves from her, their silence deafening. At the dealership, Mr. Thompson was dealing with a crisis of his own. Sales had plummeted overnight. Sponsors were calling, concerned about their association with a company facing accusations of racism. He called Barbara into his office again. This time, there was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of sympathy. "Barbara, I've reviewed everything, and there's no coming back from this," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You're fired." Barbara's mouth went dry, her throat constricting. "Please, sir, you can't." "I have no choice. I can't risk the reputation of this dealership. You brought this on yourself." Barbara felt her whole world collapse, the foundations crumbling beneath her feet. She had never imagined that one interaction, one moment of prejudice, could destroy everything she had built. Meanwhile, Salah had stayed silent about the incident. He hadn't made a statement. He hadn't responded to the media. He hadn't fueled the firestorm. But that afternoon, he did something no one expected. Instead of avoiding the dealership forever, he returned. Cameras followed as he walked through the doors again, this time greeted with nervous smiles from the remaining employees. Mr. Thompson rushed forward, unsure what to say, his face a mixture of apprehension and relief. "I didn't come to buy a car," Salah said calmly, his voice steady and resolute. "I came because I don't want this to turn into just another social media scandal. I want to talk." Mr. Thompson blinked, surprised. "Talk? With Barbara," Salah clarified, "if she's still here." Mr. Thompson hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the empty office. She's no longer employed here." Salah nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Then give me her contact. I want to meet her." The cameras outside captured the moment, the unexpected twist in the narrative. But no one could predict what would happen next. Because instead of destroying Barbara, Salah was about to do something that would shock everyone. Barbara sat at a small cafe in the outskirts of the city, nervously stirring her tea, the clinking of the spoon against the ceramic, the only sound in the otherwise quiet space. She had barely slept, her mind a whirlwind of regret and anxiety. Her career was in ruins, her reputation destroyed. People she once called friends had stopped answering her calls. The weight of her actions was crushing. Then, her phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing on the screen. She hesitated, her hand trembling, before finally answering. "Hello?" she said cautiously, her voice barely a whisper. A calm, familiar voice spoke. "Barbara, it's Mohamed Salah." Her hand tightened around the cup, her knuckles turning white. She hesitated, her throat dry, her mind racing. Why was he calling her? Why are you calling me? "I want to meet," he said simply, face to face. Rebecca's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and apprehension. The last thing she wanted was another confrontation, especially with the man who, whether he intended to or not, had turned her life upside down. But deep down, she knew she had no choice. She had to face him, to face the consequences of her actions. An hour later, she arrived at a private meeting room in a quiet part of town. Salah was already there, sitting with a relaxed but firm posture, a quiet intensity in his gaze. He gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, her legs feeling like lead, before finally lowering herself onto the chair across from him. For a moment there was silence, a heavy, pregnant silence filled with unspoken emotions. Then Salah spoke. "I didn't call you to humiliate you," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I called you because I want to understand." Barbara blinked, surprised. "Understand what? Why did you assume I was a criminal?" His voice was calm, but carried the weight of the injustice he had faced. "Was it my clothes? My accent? My skin?" Barbara swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. I don't know." Salah studied her, his gaze unwavering, searching for the truth behind her evasiveness. "I think you do." She exhaled sharply, the carefully constructed defenses she had built around herself crumbling. "Look, I've worked in sales for years. I've seen people come in, pretending to be buyers when they aren't. I've had to deal with theft, with scams. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, the shame too overwhelming. "Assumed I was one of them?" He finished for her, his voice soft, but laced with a quiet understanding. She looked away, ashamed, the tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't know who you were." "That's not the point," Salah said, leaning forward, his gaze intense. "Even if I weren't famous, would you have treated me differently if I looked different?" Barbara didn't answer because she already knew the truth. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, suffocating her with its honesty. For years, she had justified small biases, little assumptions, the subtle prejudices that had crept into her thinking. She had never thought of herself as racist. She had just been cautious, protective of her business. But now, sitting across from the man she had wronged, she saw it clearly, the ugliness of her prejudice laid bare. Salah let the silence stretch, allowing the truth to sink in, to permeate her defenses. Then, he finally spoke again. "I don't want to ruin your life, Barbara, but I do want you to take responsibility for your actions." Barbara felt a lump in her throat, a mixture of shame and defiance. "I've already lost my job. My reputation is destroyed. What else do you want from me?" "I want you to learn," Salah said, his voice firm. "And I want you to help others learn too." She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Salah sat back, thinking, his mind already working on a plan, a way to turn this negative experience into something positive. Then, he said something that left her speechless. "I have an idea." Barbara stared at Salah, trying to process his words, her mind struggling to grasp the unexpected turn of events. "You want me to do what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to talk about what happened," Salah said simply. "Publicly." Barbara felt her stomach turn, a wave of nausea washing over her. "You want me to stand in front of the world and admit I was wrong?" "Yes," Salah replied, his gaze unwavering. "But not just that. I want you to help others see what you couldn't before that day. She scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. You don't understand. The internet already hates me. If I go public, it'll just get worse. Salah leaned forward, his eyes steady, filled with a conviction that was both unsettling and inspiring. You're already losing everything. This is your chance to do something with it. You can let this moment define you as a villain, or you can show that people can change. Barbara's fingers curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to cling to the remnants of her shattered pride. But deep down, she knew Salah was right. He was offering her a lifeline, a chance at redemption, a way to salvage something from the wreckage of her life. But why? She finally asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Why are you even giving me this chance? Salah exhaled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Because I believe in redemption. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, a testament to his character, his unwavering belief in the possibility of change. Barbara looked away, battling the shame and fear that threatened to consume her. She had always prided herself on being professional, on running a business with discipline and order. She had never seen herself as someone who would be labeled a racist. And yet, here she was, sitting across from the very man she had humiliated, and he was offering her a way out. No, a way forward. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat still present, but a flicker of hope, a tiny spark of possibility igniting within her. Even if I do this, how do I know people will believe me? You don't, Salah said, his voice matter-of-fact. That's not the point. People don't change because they're forgiven. They change because they want to be better. Barbara let out a shaky breath, the weight of his words settling upon her. And what exactly do you want me to do? Salah sat back, watching her carefully, his expression thoughtful. I want you to go on camera. I want you to tell people exactly what happened. Not to make excuses, not to defend yourself, but to show others how easy it is to fall into prejudice without even realizing it. Barbara's stomach twisted, a knot of anxiety tightening within her. You're asking me to humiliate myself. Salah shook his head, his gaze unwavering. You already did that. This is about accountability. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged with unspoken emotions. Barbara thought about the thousands of hateful messages she had received, the online vitriol, the people calling for her to be fired, the friends who had distanced themselves. She had spent her whole life trying to be in control, and now she had none. But Salah was right. If she stayed silent, this moment would define her forever, casting a long, dark shadow over her life. But if she spoke up, really spoke up, maybe, just maybe, she could turn this into something more. Finally, she nodded, a single decisive movement. Okay, she said, her voice trembling, but firm. I'll do it. Salah didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded back, his expression serious. Good. A week later, Barbara found herself standing at a podium in front of dozens of reporters and cameras. The entire world was watching, the pressure suffocating, the weight of expectation crushing. She gripped the edges of the podium, her hands clammy, her heart pounding in her chest. My name is Barbara Carter, she began, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. And I was wrong. A hush fell over the room, the silence broken only by the clicking of cameras and the frantic scribbling of journalists. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to meet the cameras head-on, to confront the judgment, the scrutiny, the condemnation. A few days ago, I made a terrible mistake. I assumed something about a man based on his appearance. I treated Mohamed Salah unfairly. I humiliated him. And the worst part is, I didn't even realize how much harm I was causing until it was too late. Flashes went off, blinding her momentarily. the cameras capturing every nuance of her expression, every tremor in her voice. Journalists scribbled furiously, their pens flying across their notepads, documenting this unexpected confession. She inhaled deeply, gathering her strength, forcing herself to continue. I have spent the past week reflecting on my actions, trying to understand why I reacted the way I did. And the truth is, I don't have a good excuse. I thought I was just being cautious. I thought I was protecting my store. But in reality, I was treating a man as if he were a threat, just because of my own biases. Somewhere in the crowd, Salah watched in silence, his expression unreadable, his presence a silent support. Barbara continued, her voice stronger now, filled with a newfound conviction. What happened at the dealership was a reflection of something bigger than just me. We all have biases. Some of us recognize them, others don't. But when those biases turn into actions, when they cause harm to innocent people, we have to take responsibility. She looked down for a moment, gathering her thoughts, then back up at the cameras, her gaze unwavering. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect sympathy. But I do know that this experience has changed me. And if there's one thing I hope people take away from this, it's that we all have a responsibility to examine our own prejudices. Because ignorance is not an excuse. Silence filled the room for a long moment, a heavy, pregnant silence filled with anticipation. Then, someone started clapping. Barbara looked up, stunned. It was Salah. The applause spread, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, a wave of sound washing over her. Barbara felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of relief and gratitude flooding her senses. She had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than fear. Hope. The press conference went viral, the story spreading across the globe like wildfire. Some people remained skeptical, calling it a PR stunt, a calculated attempt to salvage her reputation. Others saw sincerity in Barbara's words, a genuine remorse, and a commitment to change. But the most unexpected response came from Salah himself. That evening, he posted a message on his social media accounts. Growth comes from recognizing our mistakes and making an effort to change. We all have lessons to learn. Let's move forward together. The post went viral, shifting the conversation, transforming the narrative. Instead of being just another scandal, the story became one of transformation, of redemption, of the possibility of change. Days later, Barbara reached out to Salah with a simple message. I don't know what happens next, but I know I want to do better. A few minutes later, a reply came. That's all that matters. Barbara stared at the screen, letting those words sink in, a balm to her wounded spirit. She would never erase her mistake, but she could choose what came next. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the right path. The dust was settling, but the story wasn't over. A week after the press conference, Barbara sat alone in a quiet park, scrolling through the endless flood of messages, some encouraging, others still filled with anger. She understood both. Her past actions couldn't be erased, but maybe, just maybe, she could start making things right. Then, her phone vibrated. A message from Salah. Are you ready for the next step? She hesitated before replying, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. What do you mean? Meet me at Anfield tomorrow. The next morning, Barbara stood outside Anfield, staring up at the massive stadium, a symbol of hope and resilience for generations. She had lived in this area her whole life, but had never stepped foot inside. It wasn't just a football stadium. It was a cathedral of dreams, a testament to the power of perseverance. When she entered, a staff member guided her through the hallways until she reached a private lounge. Salah was waiting inside, leaning against the window, looking down at the empty field, his back to her. You came, he said, without turning around, his voice calm and measured. Barbara exhaled, a nervous tremor in her voice. I said I wanted to do better. Salah finally looked at her, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Good, because this is only the beginning. He gestured for her to sit. You shared your story, but that's not enough. You need to turn it into something real, something that helps others. Barbara furrowed her brows, confused. How? Salah pulled out a folder and placed it on the table between them. I've been working with community organizations, groups that help people from different backgrounds find better job opportunities, fight discrimination, and educate businesses about unconscious bias. I want you to be involved. Barbara's breath caught in her throat. You want me to work with them? Not just work with them, Salah said, his gaze intense. I want you to tell your story, not as the villain, not as the victim, but as proof that change is possible. Barbara hesitated, her mind racing. Do you really think people will listen to me? Salah shrugged, a nonchalant gesture that belied the profound impact of his words. Some will, some won't. But the ones who do, they might start seeing the world differently, and that's worth it. She looked down at the folder, then back at Salah. He didn't have to do this. He could have walked away, let the world tear her apart. Instead, he had chosen to turn this into something bigger, something meaningful. Finally, she nodded, a quiet determination settling within her. Okay, she said, her voice firm. I'll do it. Salah smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. Then welcome to the real work. Over the next few months, Barbara committed herself to change. She attended workshops, spoke with community leaders, and listened to people whose experiences she had once dismissed. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was simply learning. And when she finally stood in front of a group of business owners, sharing her story, the shame, the realization, the change, she saw something in their eyes. Understanding. Maybe, just maybe, she was making a difference. This story reminds us that our actions have consequences, but they also have the power to inspire change. If this message resonated with you, please tell us your thoughts on how we as a society can grow past hate and prejudice. We would also appreciate you subscribing for more emotional and thought-provoking stories. Let's continue learning and growing together.